Um, Once again, good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone, and welcome back to part 2 of this series. So once again, my name is Kirby Reutter, and I wanted to give just a really brief personal intro before we get started with the training. So actually, originally, before I went to psychology, I was a Spanish major, and I actually spent 2 years living in rural Mexico, where I met and married who is now my wife. And we actually had a very brutal immigration journey. It took my wife 7 years from the day we got married to the day she became a US citizen. So along the way, I had lots of really good real world experience and exposure with issues related to immigration and acculturation, because I accompanied my wife through that whole process vicariously. But now as a professional, I'm a licensed psychologist, and I am thrilled that my life has kind of come full circle, because now I contract full time with the Department of Homeland Security, specifically working with refugees seeking asylum in this country. So I have the privilege and opportunity to work with Spanish speakers from really all over the world, especially Latin America, South America, Central America, etc. So I'm really excited to get started with part 2. So next slide. So once again, we're going to talk about ways to adapt DBT specifically to the Hispanic and Latino population. In the first training, we pretty much did a quick overview of DBT in general. Today, we're going to talk about more specific applications in terms of making DBT more applicable to this population. Next slide. So once again, I love to network. If at any point you would like to follow up with me, I would be more than happy to engage. So there's plenty of ways to reach me here. Next slide. And if you would like more information on this topic, you are more than welcome to access this resource. It's basically a self-help trauma book for clients to accompany whatever you're helping them with in trauma treatment. Next slide. And this resource is a collection of handouts you can use if you're running DBT groups or teaching DBT in individual counseling. And we are currently working on a Spanish translation of this resource, so hopefully that will be available soon. Next slide. Okay, so I'd like to start off with a couple of relevant themes before we dive into the kind of the meat and potatoes of the training. So first of all, a point I made in the first training in the series before we started talking about DBT was that Latinos and Hispanics tend to somaticize emotional issues. So it's very common that Hispanic or Latino might show up to a general medical doctor instead of a mental health counselor or a social worker. And it's also very, very common that they might focus more on the physical manifestations rather than what's going on emotionally. So just keep that in mind as we go through the training. Next slide. Is something else to be aware of is obviously language can be a major barrier when it comes to mental health treatment. And once again, that's also a theme I developed a lot more in a previous training. And one of the results of that is that there are very different outcomes based on whether someone is evaluated in English versus Spanish. And I can actually give you a personal example of that. So I have 3 little boys at home. Previously, when we lived in Ohio, a very small rural town in Ohio, all 3 of my boys were assessed before they went into kindergarten. And we were raising our kids in Spanish, we still are. And all 3 of our boys, when they were tested in English, obviously in this small rural town, they were all diagnosed with learning disorders. And all 3 were placed on IEPs by preschool before they were even in kindergarten. And of course, I knew exactly what was going on. Their vocabulary was fine. it was primarily in Spanish. And then what's fascinating is when we moved to Texas a few years ago, all 3 boys were reevaluated, and now none of them had a learning disorder. None of them had an IEP. In fact, one was transitioned from IEP to gifted and talented, right? It just goes to show what can happen when someone is not properly evaluated in their own native language. So as a result of these factors, Hispanics do tend to be undertreated compared to their Caucasian peers. Next slide. So here are just a few examples of that. So Latino and Hispanic adolescents literally receive half of the antidepressants of their Caucasian counterparts, and Latino and Hispanic children literally receive half of the ADD or ADHD medications that their, once again, their Caucasian counterparts receive, right? So that's a pretty telling statistic that Hispanics and Latino youth can potentially receive half, 50% of the services that their peers are receiving. Next slide. And the reason that this undertreatment is so significant and problematic is because mental health issues are on the rise for Latino and Hispanic populations, and especially youth and adolescents. So here are just a couple of statistics to demonstrate that point. So for example, depression is on the rise with this population. Next slide. And depression is usually a pretty good indicator of mental health factors in general, but not only is depression on the rise, but so is severe mental illness, including suicidal ideation and even suicidal behaviors. So clearly, we have a rise in mental health issues with this population, while at the same time, they are undertreated. So that's obviously a problem. Next slide. So before we start talking about specific ways to adapt DBT, I want to do a really quick review of this slide that we touched on last time, right? So if we're going to adapt a model to a specific population, we should know a little bit about what that population tends to value. So obviously, each of these values are a generalization, right? So these specific values might not apply to every single specific person within the Hispanic or Latino population, right? Just as we cannot overgeneralize other populations, that same principle applies to this one. But by and large, on average, Hispanics and Latinos do tend to value families. That's very important. Hispanics and Latinos are also tend to be better at just accepting reality. A lot of times because there are institutional systemic barriers that are not easily overcome, right? So we have this idea of fatalism. It is what it is. It can't really be changed. I guess we just need to accept it. Another pretty common Hispanic or Latino value is deference or respect, especially towards people who are older or people who occupy positions of authority. Another cultural value you might come across are more traditional gender roles. And then another value you'll probably come across is this idea that relationships are really super important. So in mainstream, middle class, American culture, we tend to, a lot of times, if we need to step on someone in order to get ahead, right? Sometimes that's what the American dream requires, so to speak, right? That's a typical value that we might have in mainstream American culture. But among Latinos and Hispanics, relationships are really important, right? More important than personal ambition. Okay, so keep these themes in mind. So as we go through different specific DBT skills, I will show how we can adapt the skills in order to factor in these different cultural themes. Okay, next slide. So the very first reframe I would like to make is the following. So in the first part of this DBT series, we defined DBT as dialectical behavioral therapy, because that's what it is, that's what it stands for. And we talked quite a bit about dialectics and what that means. But really, just the phrase itself, dialectical behavioral therapy, that's not how normal people talk even in English. And so one of the first things I do, even when I'm working with English-speaking populations, is I rephrase DBT. And I simply call it developing balance therapy, right? If you think about it, if you strip away all of the fancy philosophy terminology, that's what we're talking about, right? Dialectics is all about coming more to the middle, letting go of the extremes, right? So by rephrasing and reframing DBT with kind of my own homespun acronym here, that also lends itself well to translating this concept into other languages. So for example, if you're trying to teach a Spanish-speaking client the essence of DBT, you can simply explain, well, es terapia para desarrollar balance, right? The same way you could explain it in English. It's just a therapy technique to help you develop better balance. Next slide. Okay, so now let's go ahead and get started with the first of 4 different skill sets we'll talk about. And this first one is distress tolerance. So once again, if you're going to try to explain this to a Spanish-speaking client, you can simply say, "Estas son técnicas para manejar el estrés," right? Basically the same way you would explain that in English, right? We're going to learn some skills, some techniques to better manage stress. Next slide. Okay, so distress tolerance, in essence, from a DBT perspective, is all about teaching clients to survive the moment without making it even worse, right? So there's a couple points I want to make about that. So first of all, distress tolerance really is about the moment, right? It's about helping clients cope in the moment. In other words, these are all short-term coping strategies. DBT has plenty of long-term lifestyle changes, which we'll talk about more when we get to emotion regulation and interpersonal effectiveness. But distress tolerance really is about simply coping in the moment. And it's specifically helping clients survive that moment without making things even worse. In other words, distress tolerance isn't necessarily about making things better, right, yet. Other aspects of DBT deal with that. But the reality is you can't help someone make things better while they are still actively engaged in making things even worse, right? That's why distress tolerance is kind of the starting point here. We need to help them stop making things even worse before we can help them learn other lifestyle changes. So you can kind of think of distress tolerance as harm reduction, as containment. Another way of, and by the way, if you want to explain that concept in Spanish, it's simple as técnicas para sobrevivir un momento sin hacerlo aún peor. Another way of thinking of distress tolerance is learning to turn unbearable pain into bearable pain. In other words, we're not going to take away our client's pain. We can't do that. That's inevitable. But what we're helping them do is transform their pain, make their pain a little easier to deal with. Right. So once again, if you want to explain this in Spanish, you could say something like, vamos a aprender técnicas para transformar dolor insoportable en dolor más manejable, something like that. Okay, next slide. So the essence of distress tolerance is we're going to help our clients take all of these types of behaviors that are making things even worse, right? So behaviors that are impulsive, self-injurious, addictive, maybe even suicidal. In other words, all of these things that are just feeding even more into a crisis orientation. So in other words, all of these coping skills that are maladaptive, we're going to replace them with coping skills that are more effective. Next slide. And there are many distress tolerance skills we could talk about. In fact, we could talk about this for hours. We could talk about this for probably the rest of the day. But we're only going to talk about one, just for the sake of time. So because there are so many different distress tolerance skills, what I've done is I've kind of broken them into three broad categories. So some distress tolerance skills are about what I call a coping mindset, right? How to do a better job of coping right in your own mind. Some distress tolerance skills are about coping postures. In other words, how you can use your own body as a way to cope. And then finally, there's all of these different specific activities you can do to cope in the moment. And those are what I call coping skills. So for today, we're simply going to talk about one skill, and we're going to talk about a coping mindset. And as we talk about the coping mindset, you're going to see why I selected that one. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so like I mentioned, there's many coping mindsets, postures, and skills we could talk about. We're simply going to talk about one specific coping mindset. And the one I selected is a very well-known DBT skill called radical acceptance. So this can be a very difficult term to understand and explain to clients. In fact, it can be difficult for us as therapists to wrap our mind around this. So let's start off with a very simple lay definition, and then we'll kind of expand from there. So at its core, radical acceptance is all about learning to see things just how they are, right? Not more, not less, not better, not worse. So remember, someone with a history of invalidation, right, especially someone with full-fledged borderline personality disorder, tends to think and operate at the extremes. So radical acceptance is all about learning to see things just how they are. Okay, so next slide. So if that's all there were to radical acceptance, that would be a pretty easy concept, but it's a little more tricky than that. So part of what makes radical acceptance difficult as a concept is Marsha Linehan. Remember, she's the creator of DBT. She's using this term radical acceptance very differently than how we normally use the word acceptance in normal everyday English. So when we normally use the word accept, usually what we imply is that you're accepting something you already like, right? So for example, if I give you a gift or give you a promotion or whatever, and you accept it, you're kind of implying that, yes, you wanted that. Or if I share some kind of, let's say, a political opinion, and you say, yeah, I can accept that, what you're implying is that you agree with it. Well, radical acceptance actually means the complete opposite. So radical acceptance means that you accept something that you emphatically do not like, right? That's what makes it radical. But that's also what makes it confusing, because it's different than how we normally use that term. So radical acceptance does not mean that you approve of or agree with something. However, it does mean that you're willing to acknowledge it and embrace it anyway. So in other words, radical acceptance does not mean you like something, but it does mean that you're going to deal with it anyway. You're going to face it and deal with it. So if a client is struggling to grasp that concept, a simple analogy you can use is to ask, so is it possible to physically hug someone that you do not like? So of course that's possible. In fact, it happens at every single family reunion, right? We hug people that we don't necessarily like. So if it's possible to physically embrace something you don't like, then it's also possible to do that emotionally, right? It is possible to emotionally embrace something that we don't like. However, another point to keep in mind is radical acceptance does not mean to condone something that's wrong, right? So radical acceptance is the opposite of denial, right? A lot of times when we use the word accept, once again, in normal everyday English, we're kind of implying that, yeah, I'm just going to let it slide. I'm going to look the other way, sweep it under the rug. That's not what radical acceptance is, right? Radical acceptance is calling a spade, right? it's calling abuse abuse. It's realizing this is wrong, this shouldn't be happening, right? It's the complete opposite of denial. So in other words, you can think of radical acceptance as helping a client strip away all of their defense mechanisms that are getting in the way of dealing with the problem, right? And as we know, stripping away defense mechanisms, that can be a really painful process. And as we also know, you never strip away someone's defense mechanisms if you don't replace it with some other kind of structure and other coping skills, right? And that's where DBT comes in. So something else to keep in mind is radical acceptance is active, right? It's not passive. Radical acceptance is not about learned helplessness. Radical acceptance is taking action when you can take action. And then there's two other kind of these quasi equations that really help further unpack this term of radical acceptance. So, and these are very, very common. You'll see these a lot within DBT circles. So the first equation basically says pain plus radical acceptance leads to healing, whereas pain without radical acceptance leads to suffering. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, if you look at both those equations, what's the given? It's pain, right? Pain is not up for negotiation, right? Pain is just a basic fact of life. But when there's something painful, but we can radically accept it, well, now we can deal with it. And that tends to lead to healing. And you can use all kinds of physical or medical examples to help your clients understand this concept, right? If something is physically wrong with your body, but you recognize it, you recognize the symptoms, and therefore now you can go to the doctor and receive treatment, well, now you're on the path towards healing. Whereas on the other hand, if there's something painful in your life and you just don't deal with it, or can't accept it, or just pretend it's not that big of a deal, well, chances are that difficult situation will just get worse and worse. And once again, you can use all kinds of physical or medical analogies, right? If there's something physically wrong with your body and you just ignore it, chances are that problem could get even worse. Okay, so in DBT, we have this distinction between pain versus suffering. Suffering, specifically in DBT world, refers to pain that keeps getting worse and worse, just because we're not dealing with it. So that's kind of what the definition of suffering is, right? Pain that got worse and worse because we haven't dealt with it. And then we come to this phrase, pain is required, but suffering is optional. So what does that mean? Well, think of those definitions I just gave, right? If you look back to those two equations, once again, pain is a given. That's not up for negotiation. But not all pain has to keep getting worse and worse. That's what Marshall Hannah is referring to when she says suffering is optional, right? So obviously, there's lots of human suffering that takes place that nobody agreed to, nobody signed up for. Right? That's not what Marshall Hannah is referring to. She's referring to personal pain that we haven't faced, and therefore it's gotten worse. And another common theme of radical acceptance is this last point here. Radical acceptance is the first step out of hell. So if you remember from the first part of this training, we talked about how the first goal of DBT is to help our clients get out of hell. Remember, hell refers to the intense pain and suffering that results from emotional dysregulation. So what this phrase tells us is it's a reminder that radical acceptance is active, not passive, right? So radical acceptance isn't just realizing, hey, I'm in hell here. It's also the energy, the impetus, the momentum to take that first step to get out of hell. Okay, and here's the reason I selected radical acceptance to talk about for this specific training. So if remember, one of the themes we talked about within Hispanic Latino culture is the tendency to sometimes have what's called fatalism. So in other words, this idea that there's nothing I can do about this. It is what it is. So if you think about it, in one sense, Latinos and Hispanics might have an advantage with radical acceptance, right? They're already better at accepting reality, accepting certain realities. But where fatalism and radical acceptance are different, right? And this is something I just really briefly touched on in one of the questions that came up in the first training. Where they're different is radical acceptance doesn't stop there, right? Radical acceptance is the first step out of hell. Radical acceptance is clearly all about taking action when that's possible. So radical acceptance, like I said earlier, is not about learned helplessness. It's about recognizing the reality we have, but then also learning the skills to deal with that reality and change it if possible. Okay, next slide. Okay, and part of what also makes radical acceptance difficult is it plays out differently based on the scenario. So there are some events from the past that can't be changed. In fact, all events, nothing that's happened in the past can be changed. So just think in your own mind, have you ever worked with clients that are now struggling much more with the inability to accept something that happened in the past versus what actually happened in the past, right? What happened in the past stopped and started, or, you know, it started and it stopped. It's not currently ongoing. But sometimes what our clients most struggle with is inability to accept something from the past. So another way we need to help our clients with radical acceptance is events in the present, current ongoing events that also can't be changed. So that there are many things that are currently ongoing in, say, our own personal lives that we cannot change. Those are also things that need to be radically accepted. And you can probably think of clients that are struggling, not so much struggling with the actual issue, they're much more struggling with the inability to accept it. But then there's also events that are happening, current, ongoing, in the present, that really can be changed. But we can't possibly change them if we haven't first accepted that they're problematic, right? So these are the three main ways in which we need to help our clients apply radical acceptance. Okay, next slide. Okay, and here's why radical acceptance is so important. So first of all, pain can't be avoided, right? Like we've already established, it's just a basic fact of life. So, you know, what's a baby's first experience when they come into the world? The baby cries, right? Because coming into this world is painful. And I've also heard that it's painful for the mother. But even death can be painful, right? And then there's plenty of pain in between. So in other words, we can't get around pain. But if we try to reject reality, that makes pain even worse. Pain doesn't just go away because we decide to ignore it. No, that's when pain actually transforms into suffering. And furthermore, just because we deny reality, that doesn't change anything, right? It's still the same reality. But furthermore, if we do want to change reality, we first have to accept it. And then Marcia Linehan, something she says in her manual is that accepting may increase sadness at first, but then leads to peace and freedom. Right. So in other words, just because at first, you know, just because we're learning to accept things doesn't mean all of a sudden everything seems better. No, on the contrary. Because remember, part of radical acceptance is letting go of our defense mechanisms. So when we face reality as it really is, sometimes things even seem worse than they were. But when we're better attuned to what reality really is, right, then we have the insight and the tools we need to deal with reality, which leads to peace and freedom. And then something else Marcia Linehan says in her manual, which probably doesn't seem too encouraging at all. The path out of hell is through misery. In other words, what she's saying here is she's validating and normalizing how difficult the healing process is. So it's not like, you know, we take one step out of hell and now we're in complete paradise. No, the healing process can still involve lots of pain. Next slide. And I really love this quote from James Baldwin. So this is a really good summary of the entire discussion we just had on radical acceptance. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. That right there is the core, the essence, the epitome of radical acceptance. Next slide. Okay, so how do we know our clients might need some radical acceptance? Well, basically, if they're demonstrating too much of any of these forms of non-acceptance, right? So if there's certain issues that they're constantly lying about or making excuses about, or constantly blaming other people, or avoiding, or using too much of any kind of defense mechanism, that's probably something in their life that they need to learn to radically accept. Next slide. Okay, so there's a lot more we could have said about distress tolerance, including radical acceptance. Once again, distress tolerance has tons of specific coping skills, which are beyond the scope of this training. So let's move on to emotion regulation. So the difference between distress tolerance versus emotion regulation, at least in DBT world, is, like I mentioned previously, distress tolerance is short-term, coping in the moment. Emotion regulation, in contrast, is all about learning a new lifestyle that will support and foster a healthier emotionality. So that's what we mean by emotion regulation. And if you're looking for a way to explain this to clients, you can say something like, vamos a aprender técnicas para cuidar sus emociones. So next slide. Okay, so the first thing we need to do when it comes to emotion regulation is provide some psychoeducation to our clients on why we have emotions in the first place and why they're so important. So if you think about it, emotions provide three major functions for us. They communicate, and they motivate, and they influence. And not only that, but they do all of that non-verbally, without words. And that's what makes them so powerful. So if you think about it, we also have thoughts that communicate, motivate, and influence. But thoughts do that verbally with words. Emotions are much more efficient because they can do all of that without words. And not only do emotions communicate, motivate, influence ourselves, they also do that to other people, right? So if you think about it, would a baby even survive without emotions? The answer is no, because babies don't have words yet. They can't use thoughts and words to communicate, motivate, and influence. They do all of that through emotions alone. So remember a point I made in the previous training about how CBT basically does not give emotions their due respect, right? Traditional CBT focuses on thoughts and behaviors. That's why it's called cognitive behavioral therapy. And emotions are pretty much this annoying nuisance in the middle, right? Emotions are basically the after effect of whatever we think and the trigger of how we behave. Well, like I said last time, that is not the DBT perspective whatsoever. The DBT perspective is we need emotions. We literally cannot survive without emotions. They are one of our most important sources of information. So we need to, this is stuff we need to explain to our clients, because a lot of our clients will think, I just hate emotions. They're so stupid. I wish I didn't even have them. Okay, next slide. Okay, so after we provided basic psychoeducation to our clients about emotions, we then need to help them learn how to regulate these emotions. And a point I made last time is that I do not like one of the common paraphrases of emotion regulation, which is control emotions. I don't like that paraphrase at all, even though you will absolutely see that within DBT circles. I prefer to think of emotions as something we need to take care of and nurture and cultivate, right? That's why I use that phrase in Spanish, vamos a aprender técnicas para cuidar sus emociones, not controlar sus emociones. And I also don't like the original acronym that is used in DBT, still used in DBT. It's very common. The acronym is Please Master. Actually, I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit. Yeah, let me save that thought for a little bit. So since I'm really trying, I've spent the last 10 years of my life trying to take DBT concepts and distill them, but also make them much more culturally sensitive and much more trauma informed for that matter. So that's why I'm advocating for a paradigm shift in terms of how we see emotion regulation. So if you think of it this way, if you had a garden full of flowers, would it make any sense to try to control those flowers? For that matter, would it make any sense to coerce them, manipulate them, yell at them, scream at them? Right? That's not going to help your garden of flowers. If you want a healthy garden of flowers, what you're going to need to do is nurture them, take care of them, right? Not blame them, judge them. So that's the analogy I've developed with emotion regulation. What I've done is I've taken the six main DBT skills, and I've turned each of these skills into a specific metaphor. And each of these metaphors is all about how to better take care of our garden of emotions. So we're only going to have time to talk about the first one and the sixth one. So next slide. Okay, so this first skill is all about how to better take care of your body as a way of better taking care of your emotions. So as we all know, there's a very obvious mind-body connection. And if we're working with a client that is emotionally dysregulated, but their entire physiological system is also dysregulated, we can't really hardly even make a dent in helping them regulate their emotions, right? When their body is still out of whack. It's not going to work. So the first step in emotion regulation is teaching our clients to take much better care of their actual physical bodies. And this is where the original Please Master acronym comes in. The Please Master acronym in DBT is all about specific ways of taking care of your body. And the reason I have never liked that acronym, and I still don't, and especially in this current age we're in. So think of post George Floyd. The phrase "please master" should sound awful to you. It does to me. To me, it shocks me that a model, and I'm going to be stepping on some toes here. I'm very aware of that. But a model that's designed to be a treatment model, specifically for people who've been invalidated, why would you come up with an acronym that sounds so colonial, if not reminiscent of slavery, right? And even linguistically, the acronym "Please Master" is a stretch. So I don't like it at all. So what I've done is to make DBT much more culturally sensitive and trauma informed. I've just come up with my own acronym. And to be honest, I've done that throughout DBT. I've done this with many of the skills, come up with my own acronyms. So with this acronym SEEDS, not only does this sound much better, but this is a simple, succinct way we can help clients take better care of their bodies. And do you see how this goes along with the garden analogy, right? We're going to help clients plant the seeds of a healthier life. How? First of all, by taking care of their bodies. So if a client has physical symptoms that aren't being dealt with, that is going to cause emotional turmoil, right? If a client has absolutely no way of ever getting physical exercise, or if their eating habits are completely out of whack, or if they're hardly sleeping, or if they have all the wrong substances in their body, right? All of these things are going to further drive emotional dysregulation. That's why we need to help our clients bring some order to each of these areas of their life. So help clients set up a simple exercise routine, for example. It doesn't mean they have to be running marathons every other day, right? Help our clients with mindful eating or balanced eating. If our clients do have any untreated physical symptoms, make the referrals. So for each of these, you're not necessarily providing all these interventions yourself. If one of these areas lies outside of your area of expertise, then you simply refer, right? So make sure your clients have the substances in their bodies that they should have, right? Not the Xanax, Ritalin, vodka, meth cocktail that their neighbor has going, right? The right substance at the right dose that's prescribed. So I know in my case, if just one of these things is out of whack, I'm out of whack, right? It does not take me much to get out of whack. But think of some of our clients. Some of our clients, all of these things are out of whack, right? That's why, once again, the first step in emotion regulation is planting the right seeds by helping clients take care of their bodies. Okay, next slide. So now we're going to jump all the way to the last skill. And I realize we just skipped a bunch of skills. But once we've helped clients plant the right seeds, and we've helped them in many other ways to take care of this garden of emotions, something else we need to help our clients do is fertilize. Fertilize this garden of emotions on a daily basis. And here are 3 ways of doing this. So something we can help our clients do is every single day, schedule something positive. So in other words, don't just wait for something positive to happen. No, make sure something positive happens. Every single day, schedule it. Put it on your agenda, put it on your planner. And then something else we can help our clients do on a daily basis, right? And that's the key to these 3 skills. These are 3 things clients need to be doing every single day, right? This garden of emotions needs daily maintenance, daily fertilizing. So the second thing is help our clients build a sense of mastery. So what does that mean? That means every single day, your clients need to be doing something that fosters a sense of confidence or competence, right? In other words, every single day they need to be doing something that they're good at, that helps them feel productive or constructive. In other words, what we're doing with building mastery is we're helping clients also develop a sense of self-efficacy. So in a previous training, I talked quite a bit about learned helplessness. Building mastery is helping our clients learn to be their own agent of change. And then something else we need to help our clients learn to do on a daily basis is don't just wait for the next crisis to happen. No, cope ahead of time, right? In other words, develop a lifestyle in which you are coping on a daily basis. In other words, your coping skills are now your new normal. It's just how you do life, right? It's just part of your routine. And then when you really are triggered by something, well, then you cope even more. But the idea is don't wait till the next crisis before you start doing some coping. Make a habit, a lifestyle of coping. Okay, so those are the 3 ways to fertilize from DBT. And once again, I'm the one that came up with this whole garden analogy throughout. Next slide. But in order to make DBT more culturally sensitive, I've added a D. I think this D is very important. So especially if you're working with a client that has a religious or spiritual framework, but really all clients on a daily basis, they need to be doing something that's personally meaningful to them. Because remember, the whole point of DBT, I mentioned this in the previous training, right? The first goal is to get clients out of hell. The second goal is to help them stay out of hell. But the third goal is to build a life worth living. In other words, every single day, our clients need to check in with their value system and do something that's personally meaningful for them. Okay, so if our clients are doing all 4 of these on a daily basis, this will help them, once again, provide maintenance to their garden of emotions. Okay, next slide. Once again, there's a lot more we could have said about emotion regulation, but let's go ahead and move on to another skill set. So this is dialectical thinking. So next slide. So in other words, this is the skill set we're going to use to help our clients basically learn to be more flexible in how they think. We're going to help our clients learn to start to see things from different perspectives. In other words, start to understand someone else's perspective, but also be able to look at things from different perspectives within your own head. Right? The original thought you have, our first impression, isn't necessarily gospel truth. Maybe we need to look at things from this angle and that angle and a few other angles. Right? Dialectical thinking is all about learning to let go of the extremes and come more to the middle. Right? In other words, not being so rigid in how you think. Dialectical thinking is especially all about how to change how you think when you're presented with new information. If you think about it, so many of us have been so programmed by our childhood experiences, and even if we have completely new and different experiences in adulthood, where is our thinking coming from? Right? It's coming from those original experiences, and sometimes it's difficult to change how we think when we're presented with new information. That's what dialectical thinking is all about. So if you're wondering about ways to explain all that in Spanish, you can basically just use some of the same paraphrases that I used in English. You can say things like, vamos a aprender técnicas para tener pensamientos más balanceados, más flexibles, técnicas para poder entender diferentes perspectivas, técnicas para cambiar su manera de pensar, so, etc. Okay, next slide. Okay, so a very simple analogy you can use to explain dialectical thinking to a client is the candy bowl analogy. So if, let's assume two different people are looking at this candy bowl, and one person swears head to toe that they see Twizzlers, but the other person swears head to toe that they see jelly beans. Well, who is right? So obviously they're both right. So if you can help a client understand that two different people in their right minds that are looking at something as concrete and objective as a candy bowl can still have two entirely different perspectives and still both be right, then you can kind of use that to explain, well, actually, there's lots of things in life in which that's true, right? There's many things in life that are much less concrete than this candy bowl. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for us to truly understand and appreciate this idea of dialectics, I feel like we first need to kind of pull back the curtain and look at what CBT originally taught and still teaches, because we kind of need to see how DBT is different than original CBT. So CBT has this idea that a lot of times we blame our emotional reactions or our behavioral reactions on a specific situation. But what CBT says is, now wait a minute, it's not really the situation that caused you to feel a certain way or behave a certain way. It's really how you thought about that situation. And there's clearly some validity to that claim. But there are some situations in life in which it really doesn't matter what you think about that situation. So for example, if you put your hand on a hot stove, trust me, it really doesn't matter what you think about hot stoves. It doesn't even matter what your core beliefs are. You will have a very intense emotional and physical reaction to that situation. So CBT acknowledges that, but what CBT says is, well, fine. But at least for most things in life, how we think about things really does influence or mediate our emotions and behaviors. Okay, so far so good, I guess. But here's where that breaks down even further. What if you've been traumatized? And now what if the situation is a trauma reminder? In that case, a trauma reminder will directly and automatically trigger intense emotional and physiological reactions. In fact, that's one of the symptoms of PTSD, right? By definition, if you've been traumatized, you will have intense psychological and physiological reactions to trauma reminders. In other words, it doesn't matter what you think about that trauma reminder. You will have those reactions regardless. So can you see what would happen if you're trying to use a heavy-handed CBT approach with someone that's been traumatized? You're basically trying to convince them that's all in your head, change how you think. Okay, do you see how invalidating that message is? Not to mention completely inaccurate. So next slide. So then CBT also goes a step further, and CBT basically says, once we have this basic sequence of thoughts, feelings, behaviors, a lot of times it doesn't even matter what the situation is anymore, because this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Our thoughts drive our feelings influence our behaviors, but then our behaviors reinforce what we believed all along, and then we just go round and round the mulberry bush here. Something else, another point I want to make about the CBT model is, since we do have this sequence of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in that order, where are you going to intervene? Well, we tend to intervene at the level of thoughts. Why? Because according to the CBT model, that's what starts off the process. So that's why CBT has this idea of thinking errors, right? CBT doesn't have this idea of feeling errors or behavioral errors. No, it's all about thinking errors. The reason for that is, if our thoughts are out of whack, then our feelings will be out of whack and our behaviors will be out of whack too, right? That's why CBT emphasizes focusing on mostly thoughts. Okay, next slide. So do thoughts influence feelings? Do feelings influence behaviors? Well, of course, I don't think anyone's going to dispute that. But the problem with the original CBT model is it's grossly oversimplified, because the reality is all three affect all three at all times. In point of fact, what we now know neurologically is that feelings affect thoughts much more than thoughts affect feelings. So it kind of turns original CBT on its head. Okay, next slide. So DBT acknowledges that thoughts, emotions, and actions all mutually influence each other. So in DBT world, we don't have to deal with that specific sequence of thoughts, feelings, behaviors only in that order. So DBT gives us more flexibility. DBT basically says intervene at whatever levels is going to make the most sense. So does DBT acknowledge the reality that sometimes our thinking can get out of whack? Of course it does. So that's why DBT also gives us tools to deal with that. So next slide. So I'm going to teach you an extremely simple skill to help your clients learn to think more dialectically. And as you're going to see as I explain this, this is so much easier and simpler to use than the original CBT approach. Because the point I made last time is, if a client has a problematic belief or an inaccurate attribution style, or pick your terminology, the CBT way of dealing with that is to challenge it, to confront it, to refute it, dispute it, point out how it doesn't make any sense, it's illogical, it's irrational, etc. So a point we already made is that approach will be much too invalidating for someone that already has a history of invalidation, right? So we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to work with their grain, not against their grain. So a point I also made last time is, someone with a chronic history of invalidation tends to think and operate at the extremes. So if we already know that about how the person is wired, well, fine, let's work with that tendency, not against it. So this is how it works. We help the client identify some kind of problematic thought, and it doesn't take a ton of psychoanalysis to do that. Basically, whatever's coming out of their mouth is usually a pretty good indicator of what they're thinking. So once we've identified their thought, we then help them come up with the complete opposite of that thought. And usually, the more you can embellish that, exaggerate it, the more you can make that opposite thought just seem absolutely ludicrous, the better. And the reason for that is, a lot of times clients don't notice how much they're embellishing the original thought. But when you can embellish the opposite thought, they'll know exactly what you're doing. And you can even point that out, like, wow, you were really good at noticing how much I exaggerated the opposite thought, right? And you can say, I wonder if maybe you've done some of that to your original thought. But anyway, once we've identified the original thought and then the complete opposite, now we've identified the two end zones, so to speak. Right now that we have the two extremes, we have all of this area to work with in the middle to come up with something that is just in the middle of those two extremes. And so not at first, when you're teaching this skill to a client, they might need some help to come up with a middle thought. They might not even be able to do that on their own, especially if their thinking is really polarized. So initially, you might have to be the one to kind of help them come up with a middle thought. But over time, you want to get to the point where your client can come up with a middle thought on their own. Here's the reason. They are much more likely to believe a middle thought that they came up with than something that you did. So even if they tell you, well, here's the middle thought I came up with, but I don't really believe it, that's fine, because if they were the ones that came up with the middle thought, those words came from their head. So part of them does believe it. And even if they don't fully believe the middle thought, at least there's some competition now, right? It's not just the original thought. There's another middle thought that's circulating. And so basically they now have two thoughts, the original and the middle. And what do we know about that when we have two different beliefs at once, right? That's called cognitive dissonance, which is a very unsettling state to be in, right? So when we have cognitive dissonance, we're either motivated to change how we think or change how we behave, right? So if you think about it from a motivational interviewing perspective, this skill is perfect, because what we're doing is we're helping foster some cognitive dissonance. All right, so let me just give you a couple of really quick examples of what I mean by this skill. And by the way, thought opposite middle, I'm calling this the TOM. It's another example of an acronym that I came up with to make DBT more user-friendly for our clients. This is not from original DBT. Okay, so one example, you might have a client that says things like, I am such an idiot, I can't do anything right. Okay, so that's the original thought. So then you help the client come up with the complete opposite. So what would be the opposite of that? The opposite of that might be, I am the most brilliant person that has ever walked the face of the earth, right? I would make Albert Einstein look like a complete dunce, right? I have never made a mistake in my life. I am perfect. Okay, do you notice how much I embellish that? But that's by design. Because if someone has a thought, I'm a complete idiot, I can't do anything right, do you see how they've also embellished, right? They've probably taken some things that they're not good at, but they've just embellished it to the point where I can't do anything right. So you can do the same with the opposite. And if that opposite seems ridiculous, it's supposed to. That's the whole point. But now we have the two end zones, and now we have all of this area in between to come up with something more in the middle. So you ask the client, what's something in the middle of those two extremes? And the client might say something like, okay, fine, there are some things that I'm pretty decent at, but there's other things I absolutely stink at. Well, fine, that's a balanced thought, right? We all have things that we're good at, and we all have things that we're not good at. That's just life. That's being human. So the middle thought is not la la land, right? That's the opposite thought. The middle thought is just more realistic, right? So sometimes your clients might say something like, oh, you just want me to do this positive thinking crap. So when that comes up, I say, no, I don't. You're the one doing negative thinking crap. The opposite would be positive thinking crap. Middle is simply middle thinking crap, right? Life can be difficult enough as it is, right? Without making it even more difficult. And so just because the client has this middle thought, like I said earlier, doesn't mean now they automatically believe it 100%. But they don't have to, because you have just helped them plant that seed, right? Going back to that analogy. And here's the irony. The more they wrestle with that middle thought, and the more they say, I don't know if I believe this or not, guess what? The more they're thinking about it, and the more they're reinforcing it. That's why it's not my job to convince them of the middle thought. It's my job to simply help them identify it. And sometimes the middle thought the client comes up with isn't as close to dead center as you would like. That's fine, Because remember, the whole point of this is dialectical thinking. If we can help the client come up with any other thought that's a little more neutral than the original thought, that's already dialectical thinking, which is the whole point. Okay, next slide. Okay, so obviously there's a lot more we could also say about dialectical thinking, but for the sake of time, let's move on to another skill set. So now let's talk about interpersonal effectiveness. So I'm strategically saving this for last. The reason we started off with mindfulness, remember in the first training, is because mindfulness is foundational and you need mindfulness to learn everything else. Well, the reason I'm saving interpersonal effectiveness for last is because you need every other DBT skill we've talked about so far in order to now deal with other people. So you think about it, all the other DBT skills we've talked about up to this point have all of it been about self-regulation, right? It's going to be really difficult to deal with other people if you don't know how to be grounded with yourself. Okay, so next slide. So interpersonal effectiveness is all about how to get most of your wants and needs met most of the time. And if you remember, last time we talked quite a bit about ways to paraphrase that so you don't have to use a 9-syllable term with your clients. So in Spanish, you can do the same thing. You can say things like, vamos a aprender técnicas para comunicarse mejor, técnicas para manejar el conflicto, técnicas para mejorar sus relaciones, etc. Okay, next slide. Okay, so original DBT, interpersonal effectiveness, mostly focuses on how to teach clients to be more assertive. And if you think about it, that is so classic mainstream American, right? We are all about learning to be more assertive. So once again, what I've done is I've tweaked DBT to make it much more culturally sensitive. I mean, just think of it this way. How well would a marriage work if both spouses were absolute experts in assertiveness, but neither spouse knew how to appreciate the other person's perspective or apologize when necessary, right? So that marriage probably wouldn't work that well. So in my opinion, we need much more than just assertiveness skills. We also need to appreciate and apologize. And the appreciate and apologize part, that makes DBT much more family friendly, but also much more culturally sensitive, because other cultures are much better at appreciating and apologizing than we are. So is it true that other populations could possibly learn to be more assertive? For sure. Is it also possible that a lot of us need to appreciate and apologize better? That's for sure too. So we need all 3 legs to the stool, not just one. So we're going to learn a tool that will help us be much more effective in our relationships. So next slide. It's going to be the same tool, same basic tool for all 3. Okay, and in original DBT, this skill is called Dear Man. And actually the full acronym is Dear Man Give Fast, which is absolute acronym overload. It's too long of an acronym. But furthermore, I also don't like the acronym Dear Man, just like I don't like the acronym Please Master. So once again, for me, it is so ironic that this treatment model, and specifically designed for people with chronic histories of invalidation, that these kind of acronyms would be used. So I don't use Dear Man. I use a variation I created myself called Dear Adult. And so I'm going to explain the basics here, and then I'm also going to explain how I've tweaked it. So basically, this is a tool to teach clients to be more assertive. So clients that just don't even know what that looks like. So the Dear part is a 4-step process that we can teach clients and help them learn skills for each of these. So describe is the first thing a client needs to do whenever there's a difficult conversation they need to have. So maybe they need to correct someone or challenge someone. So the first thing they need to do is simply describe the facts, right? So exactly what happened, X, Y, Z, right? Just the facts. You're not blaming, you're not accusing, you're not judging. You're simply stating what happened. And in fact, when you're describing a situation, it's often best if you can avoid dropping the you bomb whenever possible. Because if you're describing a situation, but every other sentence starts off with you, right? That's going to come across as accusatory, and the other person is just going to become defensive and counterattack. So whenever possible, try to describe in general terms. It's something that can be really helpful is to describe using collective pronouns. So we, our, us, right? Instead of personal pronouns. So after you've described the facts, the next thing you do is express how you feel about those facts. So this is when we teach clients to use the classic I feel statement. So I feel whatever emotion when this happens. So once again, you're not judging, you're not blaming, you're not accusing. And once again, whenever possible, try to avoid dropping the you bomb. Because whenever you say, I feel so ticked off whenever you do this, right, you're back to blaming. The express is all about learning to take ownership of your own emotions. Okay. And after you've learned to express appropriately, the next thing you teach a client to do is now assert. And you'll probably have to teach them specific strategies on how to do this. And there actually is really good research out there on what it takes to be assertive and how to come across as assertive. So I'll save that for another training sometime. And then the last thing you want to do is teach. So once you've helped the client describe, express, and assert, the last thing you need to do is reinforce. So what do we mean by that? Well, there's two things you want to reinforce. One, you want to reinforce the request you just made, but you also want to reinforce the relationship itself. And in my opinion, the best way to reinforce both of those is to end on a strong, positive, upbeat win-win, right? In other words, explain how what you're asking for is also better for the other person. The reason that's so important is if you don't end on that note, then this whole sequence just came across as me, right? I'm describing the facts as I see them, I'm expressing how I feel, and I'm going to tell you what I want. That is not very endearing. That's not a very convincing way to get someone on board. So reinforce really needs to be about reinforcing the other person's perspective and reinforcing what the other person also needs. Okay, and here's why this order is so important. If you mix up the order, it doesn't really work. So you can't really reinforce something that you haven't even talked about yet. But it also doesn't work if you start off asserting yourself. That is not people that just walk around all day asserting themselves, right? How do they come across? They come across as bossy or demanding. But it also doesn't work very well to start off expressing yourself, right? How do people come across that just express themselves all day? That is also not too endearing. But instead, if you describe, if you start off on neutral turf and start off with the facts, you're starting off on the same page. And not only that, but the person now has a context for what you're going to be talking about. It's not just coming out of left field. So you describe first, and then now you've primed the pump, and now you can express how you feel respectfully. So now the person, not only do they understand the situation, but they even understand how you feel about the situation. In other words, now they have two levels of context before you've even asserted. Right? That's why this sequence is so important. So now when you assert, even if the person disagrees with you, at the very least, they've been tracking with you. So I know in my case, when someone is just overly assertive out of the blue and I didn't see it coming, I feel attacked. But when I know the context, when I know the situation, how the person feels about the situation, I don't feel threatened anymore. Okay, so the deer is a specific sequence. Now, the adult voice, what that means is your delivery is also really important. So the adult voice is the middle ground between the parent voice, which is yell and scream and lecture, and the child voice, which is whine and pout and throw a tantrum. So if you pull off the deer perfectly, the sequence, describe, express, assert, and reinforce, but you do it as an angry lecture or as a pouty tantrum, it's not gonna work. So that's why this reminder to stay in the middle with the adult voice is crucial, right? The delivery matters just as much as the nuts and bolts of describe, express, assert, and reinforce. Okay, so we can teach this skill to clients to help them be better, more assertive. So next slide. But like I mentioned, to make this skill much more culturally sensitive and just more user-friendly across the board, you can also use the same skill to help clients better appreciate someone else's perspective. So for example, whenever I do marriage counseling, which I actually try to avoid at all costs, but when I do, I don't want both spouses to become absolute experts in asserting and that's it, like I already mentioned. So after one client has done a dear adult to assert, I want the next person to do a dear adult to appreciate before they do their own dear adult assert. So this is how it works. After the first person has expressed themselves, what the next person does is they describe what the other person just said. So summarize, paraphrase, and then empathize, right? So not only summarize what the other person said, but make sure that they're also understanding the other person's emotions. And from there, say something to appreciate the other person's perspective. And then from there, reinforce it even more. So what I tell clients is get to the point where you can articulate, if not advocate, for the other person's perspective even better than they just did, right? Not to one up them, obviously that's not the point, but to demonstrate that, yeah, I'm really tracking with you. I'm really attuned to what you're telling me. And now you're ready to do your own dear man assert. And not only that, the other person is ready to hear it. Right, so this is kind of a counterbalance to the original dear man assert. This also gives clients a tool to learn to appreciate what other people are saying. And then, next slide. You can also use this same basic framework to teach people effective ways to apologize, which is obviously a huge part of interpersonal effectiveness. And I don't know about some of you, but I've absolutely had many clients who have needed to learn this skill, right? It's not a skill that we always learn in our culture. So this is the acronym that's appropriate to use when you have to do some damage control. So describe what you did wrong. And then once again, empathize with the other person's perspective. Wow, you must have felt XYZ, disappointed, betrayed, upset. And then express some kind of verbal apology. But once again, the key here for all three of these skills is to reinforce. Because an apology only carries so much weight if we don't actually do something differently. So reinforce is explaining exactly what you're going to do differently to repair the damage, to reconcile, what you're going to do differently moving forward, right? If I kick you in the shin and say, oh, I'm so sorry, and then kick you in the other shin, I probably wasn't that sorry, right? So reinforce is basically showing with behavior that you meant your apology. Once again, through all of these skills, the delivery is really important. We need to use the adult voice. Okay, next slide. Okay, and there's obviously way more we could have said about interpersonal effectiveness. I simply introduced one basic skill. So in the last few minutes of the training, I would like to circle back to the theme of mindfulness. That's something we talked about last time. Next slide. And really quickly, next slide. Okay, yeah. So really quickly, I'd like to cover a slide. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'd like to cover a slide that we did not get to at the end of the training last time. So this Venn diagram that you see here is a classic DBT skill. But once again, I've kind of tweaked it to make it more trauma informed and more culturally insensitive. So basically what this tool shows us is part of our mind does the thinking and part of our mind does the feeling. And as you can see, we need both. So the first thing we need to do with our clients with this skill is provide psychoeducation on what is a thought and what is a feeling. So you might be thinking, oh my goodness, who does not know that? Well, if you're thinking that, you might forget that the normal person does not go to school for 5 years or 10 years just to sit around all day and ponder thoughts and feelings, right? Trust me, that's not a normal thing to do. And if you think about it, even in normal everyday English, people confuse these terms all the time, right? You ask someone what they think and they'll tell you exactly how they feel about something. You ask someone how they feel about something and they'll tell you exactly what they believe, right? So we use these terms interchangeably. So we need to explain, well, in counseling, we actually mean different things by this. So a very simple analogy I use with some of my clients, especially when I'm working with adolescents, is I ask them, what's your favorite song? And after they tell me their favorite song, I ask them for the lyrics of that song. And after they tell me the lyrics of that song, I usually regret having asked for the lyrics of the song. But anyway, now that's out there, I say, okay, so your song has words running through it. We happen to call those words lyrics. Well, guess what? Your mind also has words running through it, right? We call those words thoughts. But then I ask them to explain the music of the song. So that's when they explain things like the beat and the rhythm and the vocals and instrumentals and harmony, pitch and all that. And then I explain, oh, so your song has words going through it, but it also has music going through it. That's so interesting. Well, guess what? Same with your mind. We don't just have words going through our mind. We also have music. And we happen to call that music emotions or feelings. And you can develop that analogy even further. You can explain how, you could probably just recite the words of that song with no music, and you would still get some meaning out of it, but it wouldn't be the full meaning. Or you could just listen to the music of that song, and yes, it would speak to you, but it's going to speak to you even more when you have the thoughts, when you have the words that go along with it. Okay, so that's just a simple analogy to help clients understand the difference between thoughts versus feelings. So if you think about it, the gift of the thinking mind is that it's verbal, but the gift of the feeling mind is that it's nonverbal, right? So as humans, we do have this gift of language. It's absolutely amazing. It's why we have, culture and civilization, etc. But if you think about it, to this day, how do we communicate more, verbally or non-verbally? We actually communicate more non-verbally. If you don't believe me, just think of the next time someone says something to you with their words, but their body language and facial expressions completely contradicts it. What do you instinctively believe automatically? Right? Their body language and facial expressions. So our mind is constantly giving us these verbal message and nonverbal messages. So since we have two sources of information, right, we need to be dialectical. That's why we need this wise mind in the middle. And a lot of times I call this the balanced mind. So think of the wise mind as the mind behind the mind. It's the it's the part of the mind that observes the rest of the mind. So if you think about it, for thousands of years, poets and philosophers and theologians and psychologists and many other groups of people have come up with different words for this phenomenon, such as soul or the spirit or the conscience or intuition. All of those words work. They're all part of the wise mind. The job of the wise mind is to notice what we're thinking and feeling. And then from there, if necessary, to regulate what we're thinking and feeling. And then ultimately to make decisions based on what we're thinking and feeling. So nobody's wise mind is perfect, but a well-developed wise mind over time gets better and better at making good decisions by factoring in both verbal and nonverbal input. And a well-developed wise mind is flexible. A well-developed wise mind might decide sometimes to go with the thinking mind. That's fine, as long as it's coming from the wise mind. Or sometimes the wise mind might decide to go with the feeling mind. That is completely fine, as long as it's coming from the wise mind. Sometimes the wise mind will come up with a completely novel conclusion because something else the wise mind is tapping into is all prior experience. So wise mind might consult with the thinking mind, consult with the feeling mind, but decide, you know what? I'm gonna do something else based on my prior experience. Okay, so every mindfulness exercise in DBT, the whole point of it is to get into that wise mind, to bolster that wise mind and strengthen it. Okay, so I just want to briefly explain how I've tweaked this. So in original DBT, Marcia Linehan doesn't use the word thinking mind. She used the word reason mind. And she uses the term emotional mind on the other side. The reason I don't like the term reasonable mind is because what does that imply about feelings? Well, therefore they must not be reasonable, right? That's a bias of our culture. And furthermore, are our thoughts always completely reasonable? No, of course not. Can our emotion mind get out of whack? Of course. But can our thinking mind also get out of whack? Just as much so. So that's why I call this thinking mind and feeling mind. It's a little more neutral in terms of the terminology there. And like I said, I also like to call the wise mind the balanced mind, because the balanced mind knows how to be dialectical, knows how to be flexible, knows how to navigate all kinds of other ways that we can get out of balance in life. Okay, so now let's just move on to the next slide as we wrap up. Okay, so I want to introduce this idea of a DBT house, and actually we can go to the next and final slide. Okay, so this is a visual tool you can use to teach lots of different DBT skills and concepts to clients. I especially love doing this with kids. So I contract with a residential, and I've done this many times with the residents there. This brings together a lot of the DBT concepts we've talked about, but actually many more that we haven't talked about. So DBT has this idea of 4 basic stages of treatment. So the first stage is basically just rein in your general life chaos. So what are the major life issues that you need to work on? So that's level 1. From there, the next phase of DBT treatment is, so what are the emotional issues that you want to work on? So that's the second floor of the house. And the third floor is, what are the minor or everyday issues that you need to work on? That's the next floor. And then the upper floor is, so what are your goals? What are your dreams for the future? Remember, DBT is all about ultimately making your life worth living. And then you just fill out the rest of the house with all of these different details. So the billboard is, what are you proud of? The chimney is how you blow out steam. Door, what do you keep hidden from others? Walls, what supports you? Roof, what protects you? The foundation is, what are your values? And once you have this house complete, now your client has a really good visual of what DBT is all about, right? They have a framework to understand why they're learning all of these different skills. Okay, and I think that's it. I think that gives us 2 minutes for a question and a half.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kirby. So we have several questions. The first one is, would you recommend a client doing the skills workbook without continued participation in counseling?
Yeah, some clients can go through the self-help workbook on their own and be fine, and others will need some coaching. So it really depends on how severe is the trauma work that you intend to do with them.
Okay, thank you. The next one is, are there studies on whether conducting DBT with the Spanish population is equally effective if a Spanish interpreter is utilized versus patients working directly with a Spanish-speaking therapist?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any research that I'm aware of specifically on DBT through interpreter. I know counseling by and large done through interpretation isn't quite as effective as doing it in the client's native language. And that's really why we're trying hard to get DBT resources into Spanish.
Great. I have another one. It says, I would like to know how to implement radical acceptance with those who are in extremely distressing and traumatizing positions. For example, immigration detention, children separated, etc. I work in a humanitarian assistance, and this part is tricky for those who are in a truly traumatic settings like conflict zones and detention centers.
Yes, trust me, I get it, because I work in one of those centers. So I work with families who have been separated. I work with mothers and minors who have been in detention for almost a year now. And so yeah, radical acceptance is a really tough skill to teach. And there's way more we could have said about it that I didn't, just for the sake of time. But just a couple points. One point is other cultures tend to be much better at radical acceptance than a lot of us Americans. So they have that to their advantage. But in my opinion, the key to helping make radical acceptance work is tapping into the client's belief system. So one of the DBT distress tolerance skills that we did not have time to talk about is the meaning skill, right? Meaning is all about finding purpose in suffering. And when we can do that, help clients figure out a purpose for why they're going through it, that makes radical acceptance a lot easier to apply and implement. In my opinion, radical acceptance without a meaning system is really difficult.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Could you please provide an example on how we might manage fatalismo to get individuals closer to radical acceptance and away from helplessness?
Yeah, so, okay, so teaching clients about learned helplessness, but also teaching them to be advocates for themselves, helping clients figure out what they can't control and change versus what they can, and then teaching them to learn to operate within their sphere of influence. So especially if we're using the example of immigration, so helping clients realize that there are ways that they can speak up and directing them to appropriate channels for doing that.
Thank you. The last question is, I'm curious how to best address racial, cultural privilege difference between clinician and client. As a white student starting to be LMHC with an art therapy specialization, I recognize how important it is to sorry, this is really long, to not ignore the differences between our backgrounds. Furthermore, it is important for myself to be aware of the historical and ongoing atrocities committed against BBOC, in this case, Hispanics and Latinos. Do you have any suggestions about how to go about this in a manner that is culturally humble and culturally sensitive without making the clients feel like the clinician is trying to separate themselves from the client's experience or is putting the client on the spot?
Yeah, great question. So glad this came up because this gives me an opportunity to state the obvious that I am obviously a white male, and yet I tend to work a lot with Hispanics and Latinos that are female, and the reason I'm using the term Latinos is because I'm also working with minors. So, and I addressed this in the previous training. So what helps me is to constantly take a posture of cultural humility. So I kind of turn my whiteness and my maleness on its head And I constantly say things like, I cannot even believe, I cannot understand what you're going through. I can only relate to, a certain extent. Help me out. I want you to teach me. And since I am not a native Spanish speaker, I can also use that to my advantage. I can use that to once again put me in a step down position. Like, help me understand exactly what you mean by that. I want you to teach me more Spanish so I can better understand. So that's how I use those factors.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Dr. Kirby, for your participation, for your time, and because you explains DBT in a more easy way. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone that was today's in our webinars.
Thanks for letting me join.
Have a nice day.
You too.